And I was not prepared to put all of our eggs in the basket of a Justin Trudeau-owned pipeline, TMX. I thought this was an essential hedge against that political risk.
What you just heard was Alberta Premier Jason Kenney explaining to conservative blogger Corey Morgan a few days ago that his government invested $7.5 billion, and that'd be $1.5 billion of equity and potentially $6 billion of loans to TC Energy to support the Keystone XL pipeline. And he explained why he did it. And in that comment you just heard, he talked about how he wanted to offset, it was a hedge against the political risk associated with Transmountain Expansion, and that risk would have been created by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now here's the problem. I've covered the Transmountain Expansion ever since Trudeau approved it in the fall of 2016. All through the legal challenges by the city of Burnaby, then the joint challenges, legal challenges with the government of BC and Burnaby, all defeated in BC courts. Then the political controversy that led to the big wine war between Alberta and BC, and eventually Kinder Morgan wanted to get out of the project, and the government of Canada had to step in and spend $4.5 billion buying Kinder Morgan Canada assets and the project, which it then had to commit, and it looks like it'll be $12 billion to finish it. So they were all through that. And then there was judicial reviews by First Nations groups. And in fact, the government lost one of them and had to go back and take 9 months and redo consultations with First Nation groups in BC and do it right. And then they won the judicial review. And then they began construction, and they have, the project is now on schedule to be finished in 2022. And I can say, after all of that reporting and all of the interviews I did with experts during that time, that from 2016 to now, the resolve of the government and the Prime Minister has never wavered. There's never been any sense, any indication, any hint that the government was going to backtrack on its commitment. So I would say, in my opinion, based on my reporting, that the political risk associated with Justin Trudeau and TMX is essentially zero. That pipeline is going to be, barring a miracle, that pipeline is definitely going to be built. But let's talk about another considerable risk and a very public risk, and that is Joe Biden's opposition to Keystone XL. Now, he was vice president when Barack Obama withdrew the presidential permit in 2015. All throughout the intervening years, he opposed Keystone XL, and he made it very clear on the election campaign that if he becomes president, that he will pull the presidential permit that Donald Trump reapproved. He'll pull it once again. He'll basically cancel the project. So that seems to me to be very, very high risk. But let's look at the date when Jason Kenney made the announcement about the Alberta government support for the project. It was July 3rd. So it's exactly 4 months from then until the election, which is completed less than 2 weeks ago. And why would the government not wait 4 months to see who was going to win that election? What was the rush? I mean, there's potentially $7.5 billion at risk. Well, and at a minimum, the $1.5 billion that of equity that would almost certainly be, that it will be certainly be lost if Biden pulls the permit. So all the government had to do was wait 4 months, and it decided not to do that, and it put the money, Alberta tax money, at risk because it was supposedly hedging against non-existent political risk associated with Transmountain Expansion. It's a very nonsensical argument and simply doesn't jibe with the evidence. Now, here's another clip of Jason Kenney talking to Corey Morgan, where he talks about an additional consideration on his part, sending a message to foreign-funded activists.
Frankly, if we had not come forward with our $1.5 billion preferred equity stake in KXL, it would be dead. It would not have moved forward because of the legal and political risk associated with the campaign to landlock Alberta. So we thought it was essential to send a message to the interest groups trying to block us that resistance is futile.
So what you need to know about this clip is that it's entirely based on, we'll call it research, but let's put air quotes around it, by Vancouver blogger Vivian Krause, who's been at this for a decade, alleging that American foundations were funding the tar sands campaign, and that stopped pipeline projects, and it's become a huge issue. Well, in May of 2019, I was the first journalist who went and actually did the work of interviewing environmental groups and digging into this story. And I wrote a 9,000 word debunking, a deep dive, and debunked Vivian's, it's completely, utterly not true. There's a small kernel of truth in the amount of money that was put into the tar sands campaign. But you'll hear the Premier Kenney, if you go back and listen to Morgan's podcast, talk about how this were primarily foreign funded opposition. Well, it's exactly the opposite. That's not true. Foreign funding from the American foundations was roughly between 10 and 20% of the money that went into the tar sands campaign that opposed pipeline projects like Keystone XL and Transmountain Expansion on the Canadian side. And that money basically dried up in 2015. And it's in the piece that I wrote about that. I had numerous sources who were familiar with this and knew that after the Alberta government tabled the climate leadership plan in the fall of 2015, the American Foundation said, well, that's what we wanted. We wanted Alberta to have climate policy to deal with emissions, and they cut their funding. It went from a $4 million a year to a trickle, basically nothing. And that is never, so the Premier's comments about activists are completely and utterly inaccurate here. So what activists might be in play? Well, those are American activists, and they're not really activists at all. I mean, yes, there's some environmental groups, and they're funding legal challenges left and right. And then there's landowners like the ones in Nebraska that are worried about the pipeline spill getting into their aquifer. And then there are Native Americans, and those are the people who are bringing these legal challenges and opposing KXL and doing all the organizing. It has nothing to do with the tar sands campaign and Canadian activists or Canadian organizations or Canadian money. It's entirely American. So what message was the Premier of Alberta sending by committing $7.5 billion? What message was he sending to American activists? Well, nothing. There was no whatever political risk is associated with legal challenges from Americans, there's nothing he can do about it. That is something that has to go through the courts, and TC Energy, the proponent, has to either challenge it and win, or they lose, and then the project may never get built, regardless of what Biden does. But nevertheless, so here we have the Premier saying for the first time, admitting what his political calculations were around committing $7.5 billion of Alberta taxpayers' dollars. He's never told journalists, he's never said it in the House, he's never said it any place, but he tells a conservative blogger. I mean, this would be information that I think Albertans would like to have known a little bit sooner. And I have to tell you, at the end of the day, this is just stupid. Because at the very least, the government stands to lose probably between $1.5 billion and $2 billion because Joe Biden got elected. He now sits, as of today, he has 306 electoral college votes, and it appears almost a certainty that on January 20th, he will become president if he follows through on his word. And I've interviewed a number of experts, including Professor Ryan Kennedy of the University of Houston. He's a political scientist. And he said the chances of Keystone XL being approved are this much. I give Keystone XL a 1 in 10 chance because, maybe Prime Minister Trudeau will be able to work some kind of a deal with the new president and salvage KXL. And the government has said, the Trudeau government has said, ironically enough, that it will put KXL high up on its list of priorities when it begins to talk to the new president. So the argument for all of this money going into Keystone XL to hedge political risk is utter nonsense. There's no political risk to be hedged on the Canadian side with Justin Trudeau and Transmountain Expansion. And the government and Jason Kenney have seriously miscalculated the risk associated on the American side. They simply had to wait 4 months, and then they would have had a much better and much clearer view of what that risk was. They didn't do it. To me, this is just gross misconduct, gross negligence on behalf of the government.